Hello, everybody. Welcome to Taquitos de Sesos for the month of August. Today, I'm very excited to introduce to you Dr. Jessica Rohr. Dr. Rohr earned her doctorate degree in clinical psychology from the University of Kentucky and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the Houston VA. She is a staff psychologist at Medinger and an assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine. She is a member of the Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology Consortium, APA, and the Texas Psychological Association. She specializes in women's mental health and serious mental illness, and her research focuses on women's issues, personality, trauma, and substance abuse. She also functions as an educator, focusing on evidence-based practices. So we're very happy to have Dr. Rohr today. She is presenting Mothers in the Workplace, and this is part 2 of our series of Women in Academic Medicine. So thank you very much, Dr. Rohr, and the time is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Strutt, for allowing me to be here. I'm very excited to give this presentation. I had a really good time researching for it. This is a newer topic for me, even though I've focused on women's mental health. Thinking about mothers in the workplace has been a bit different. And as you can imagine, there's quite a bit of research out there in different ways to look at working mothers and what that might mean for them and their families and their employers. So I kept it pretty high level in the hopes that the different things that I talk about might strike a nerve, some interest in people who are interested in looking deeper into any of this. So there may be times when you feel like you wish I would say more about something, and I'm feeling that way too, but in the interest of time and sort of wanting to give you a taste of what's out there, that's why I'm keeping it pretty surface level. So let's start out talking about what we do know about working mothers. Are mothers working outside of the home? Yes, we could just end this section. As of 2011, about 70% of women with children under the age of 18 in the US are working outside of the home. And this is a huge increase from the 47% that were doing so in 1975. The expectation is that that will increase by another 5.5% by 2022. Not only are mothers working outside of the home, they're also the primary or the sole earners for almost half of the households with children under 18 today, compared with 11% in 1960. So this is no small amount of people are mothers working outside the home. So to think a little bit more about what that looks like, this is the labor force participation rate of mothers by the age of their youngest child. The rates vary with the age of their youngest child, and the rates are very different from how they were in the 70s and have increased steadily over time. One of the things that you'll notice is the gap between the participation rates of women whose youngest child was under 3 years versus under 18 years that's gotten steadily smaller over time. So many more women with young children are going back to work. The labor force participation rate for fathers has seen not a lot of variation, with over 9 in 10 fathers participating in the labor force regardless of the age of their youngest child. And we'll come back to some of the other differences between working mothers and fathers as we go. So what are we doing? I meant to say this at the beginning. I have a special interest in this because I am a working mother, and I think there are a lot of people in here and perhaps listening as well who are working mothers. So what are we doing? These are some of the most common areas of employment for women in which mothers are overrepresented and mothers are underrepresented. So we're seeing a lot more mothers than non-mothers as teachers, as nurses, as teaching assistants, physicians and surgeons, all of those. We're seeing a lot fewer mothers than non-mothers in the section to the right. So cooks, hairstylists, social workers, secretaries, and managers. This is more first-line managers of like retail stores, things like that. This is according to the Census Bureau in 2017. So this is women aged 25 to 54. I want to talk a little bit about mothers in academia, and we'll come back to this a few times. If anybody was lucky enough to tune into Dr. Stinson's talk about a month ago, you'll know some of this already. But just as a quick refresher, women comprise half of those who get a doctoral degree, but less than a third of full professors in the US. Across the board, women in academia are less likely to become parents than other professional women. And we're looking out about 15 years, 14 years from the PhD. 62% of women with tenure in the humanities don't have children. About half of those in the sciences don't have children. We will talk more about this as well, and particularly some of the reasons why, but just want to look at this for a minute. So the early baby, the way that this study conceptualized an early baby is having a child within 5 years of obtaining your PhD. So what does that do to the percentage of people who are tenured at four-year institutions? So you can see how up to about the 4 to 6 mark, the lines are pretty close to each other because that's about the 5 years out from PhD that we're talking about for early babies. Some things I want to point out, women who have early babies, so within 5 years from their PhD, if you look at 12 to 14 years out, much, much fewer of them. There's about a 24% gap between men and women's rates of achieving tenure in the social sciences. I'm sorry, about 24% in the sciences, about 20% in the social sciences. Another little interesting point about this, and I keep saying this, but we'll come back to this. Is there anything that you notice about the men who have early babies? They are much more likely, there's a higher percentage of men than across the board with early babies. So for whatever reason, having babies early on in their career makes men more likely to be tenured than the norm. So what is having it all? How do we work and have our family life? What does that mean and what does that look like? For some of us, for most working women, there's a balance between the work-family gain and the work-family strain. So we'll start out talking about the gain. I see some mothers smiling in here at that. The work-family gain. So this is the idea that there are some absolute benefits that come from participating in both work and family domains. This is the expansionist approach to human energy. So this is the idea that participating in one role can actually make you more energized for your other roles. It does not sap your energy. There's not a finite amount of energy. So when you're doing a good job in one role, I'm seeing some laughing, that can lead to feeling like you're doing better at your other roles. So this theory suggests that combining work and family roles and participating in multiple roles is good physically, good mentally, and is associated with better relationships, both with your children and with your husband or partner. And in general, working mothers do describe jobs as being more positive than negative, having more positive than negative experiences, and as not having a ton of work-family conflict. Anecdotally, I talked to a few of my friends who are working moms while making this talk, and many of them do say that they feel like they're better able to be mothers at home because they are going to work. They feel like they're doing a better job at that than they would if they weren't at work. We also know that mother's time at work has not actually resulted in an overall decline in sleep or leisure time. And how do we make time for that? It seems pretty consistent across the research that mothers who work are not doing as much housework anymore. It's not that there's been a better balance across the board, it's just not being done by mom or dad and by increased multitasking. So work-family strain. Work-family strain is the partner of work-family gain. Work-family strain, they don't exist on a continuum, they kind of exist side by side. So work-family strain is more based on that scarcity theory of human energy. If human energy is 100%, you split it out between your different roles. When you devote energy to one role, when you're all in at work, you don't have as much energy to bring home. So this suggests that there are some major challenges to combining those work and family roles, and that it may adversely affect the well-being of working mothers, and that it may cause some mothers to substantially decrease involvement with work. And what we do know is that this depends on the quality of the work that they're doing. So fulfilling multiple roles is a good thing until you reach that role overload. So as with everything in life, there's a balance to be found there. And you really want to consider the quality of roles over quantity. This is especially important to think about when we are thinking about early career, be it psychologists, academics, because there are a lot of opportunities that are presented that we are taught to say yes to. You say yes to everything. And the suggestion here is that in order to not be overloaded with the roles, that we need to be really careful about the quality of the roles that we're choosing. We're not saying yes just to say yes, but we're saying yes because it's meaningful in some way, whether for work or for family. We'll talk about this a bit more. I'm going to touch on postpartum depression, but one of the, I mentioned the quality of the job. So when people feel that the quality of their job is low, when they feel like their autonomy is low, when they feel like they're not being considered in the mission of the company, and when they're not allowed to take appropriate time and leave, that's going to lead to more of this role strain. For mothers, an important factor is the psychological commitment to work. It significantly predicts the likelihood that we're going to continue working if we're committed to work. And one of the major ways that it's predicted 3 years out from childbirth is how committed we are about a month out. So that's, if you're ready to go back to work and you want to be there a month out, you probably still will be there 3 years out. There are some other factors. Education level. The higher the education level, the more committed we are to work. Interestingly, higher income to needs ratio. If you need the income less, your psychological commitment to work is higher. Hours worked per week. Job rewards. If you feel like you're getting some sort of either extrinsic or intrinsic rewards from your job. And then the work-family gains that we talked about earlier. As you might imagine, our commitment to work is negatively predicted by the quality of our marital relationship. The child's birth order. If this is your first child, your psychological commitment is much higher than if this is your fourth child, and then work-family strains. So let's talk about the motherhood penalty. This is from data from a study a couple of years ago that kind of made the rounds in the press, and it suggested that the gap in gender inequality, which again, if you were able to see Dr. Stinson's talk, you learned more about that. But the gender gap for salary earnings started way early in the 20s and early 30s of age. And so the major conclusion from this data was that that's about the time when many women are entering motherhood. And so this is kind of made the rounds as being considered the motherhood penalty. So not only, and we'll talk about this a bit more, but not only are salaries lower, but we're also seeing impacts on promotability, impacts on people feeling like they can go back to their job and feeling like they are valued at their job. So what you don't see here is a gap for men, or a dip for men in their late 20s, early 30s. And this has often been referred to as the fatherhood bonus. So what is the difference between working motherhood and fatherhood? We'll start at home. As we know, there's a generally gendered division of unpaid labor, and this is going to be your household tasks and your emotional labor. Emotional labor is, I could and would like to do a whole talk on this if you'd allow me. Emotional labor is the amount of work that we have to do in our heads to make sure that the dogs get the vaccines the right way, that the kids get the doctor's appointments met, that we know when the groceries are going to be put in. There's all of these kind of little things, and the sort of standard question from the male participant, the male partner, is, well, you could have just asked. Why didn't you just ask? And that's sort of the baseline idea that we have to be the askers, that women generally need to be both the manager and the major worker. So those gender differences we know are profound, and they become much more pronounced after children are born. So if there tends to be a pretty equitable arrangement before children are born, most likely after children are born, that will naturally go towards a more gender division of that labor. Over time, we do know that men are increasing their participation in those domestic tasks. However, it's not at the same rate that we are going to work. So it's not matching quite yet. But we do know that in couples who have progressive gender attitudes, couples who are raising and cohabiting, raising their children together, the housework is shared more equally. And highly educated men have been found to do more childcare and generally more housework than other men. So at work, what do we see? Across the board, parents in general are regarded as less committed to work. However, only mothers are then regarded as less competent because of that. So some have argued, and as we talked about with this, that it isn't gender per se that leads to this continued gendered wage gap, but it is motherhood coming on board. and the fact that mothers are working at work and then working more at home. We know that motherhood decreases the likelihood that female applicants will be contacted for a position, though fatherhood has no effect on a male applicant's success. This is in vignette studies. We also know that in general, women are more likely than men to change their work schedules around to meet family demands, and men are more likely to change home responsibilities around to meet work demands. And mothers earn 60 cents for every dollar earned by fathers, with a 5% penalty for each child they parent, while father salaries can actually increase when they become fathers. That's that fatherhood bonus. So what's going on here? What do we think that this is coming from? What is this maternal wall? These are the walls of we got the glass ceiling up here, and then we got our maternal walls over here. So to understand what might be going on here, we need to understand what determines advancement, what determines career success. There are two major theories that help us to understand the different ways that we think people move up in their career. One is the contest mobility theory. This is the idea that in order to advance, it's open season. Everybody advances based on their individual performance and contributions, and it's thus completely contingent on your behavior. Are you showing up? Are you doing your tasks? Are you putting in your face-to-face time? Bless you. The other theory is the sponsored mobility theory. And this is the idea that advancement is actually determined by the choices of the higher ups, the most powerful among us, and that they kind of look at who they're working with, and they determine, oh, this person is going to be the most successful, and so they give them the opportunities that they need to then succeed. Obviously, you know, we're psychologists. The idea is it's most likely both, or I'm a psychologist. I don't know what everybody else is, but the idea is that most likely explanation is a combination of both. So this contest mobility theory is most consistent with one of the explanations that is often called choice or family needs. Some people call it preference, so it's not so much a choice of A or B, but it's a preference of A then B. And that's the idea that mothers are not advancing because they are making choices that disengage them from work in favor of their family. The other theory is more consistent with a bias explanation. So this is the idea that there are stereotypes, discrimination that limit the upward mobility of mothers. So we'll talk a bit about some of the pieces that may go into this contest mobility theory, the choice explanation. And the pieces that have the most research right now are these kind of, you know, the word choice is really sticky for me, especially with postpartum mental illness, obviously. But the idea is these are things that people are actually doing rather than perceptions about people that may lead to differences in ability to move up. Breastfeeding is one of those things. So when we think about breastfeeding, there are many benefits. Again, many of them are outside of the scope of this presentation. So I wanted to really focus in on how does breastfeeding interact with working. And we see that in controlling for many other factors, breastfeeding is predictive of higher employee productivity. It's predictive of lower absenteeism, and the idea there is that because breastfeeding tends to improve a baby's immune system, they aren't sick as much, and so mom is not out to take care of their sick child as much. Employees stay longer at work when they're breastfeeding, and there's lower healthcare spending. And when breastfeeding is supported by the employer in some way, there's improved morale and positive company image, not just for the mothers of the company, but across the board. We also know that employment outside the home has a negative influence on the duration of breastfeeding, not on the initiation of breastfeeding. And so what that means is that people are not, it's not that they're not starting breastfeeding because they know they're going back to work, it's that they're stopping once they go back to work. And their odds of discontinuing are the highest in the first 2 months. So if they can make it through the first 2 months of returning to work, the percentage of women who are breastfeeding while working is similar to those who are breastfeeding at home. Obviously, professional women have significantly greater success than women in retail, admin, and construction. And the reason is there's a lot more autonomy. A lot of times they have an office that they can close the door to. They have more control over their time. If you're salaried, you're not having to clock out to breastfeed. And there's a lot more access to employer-sponsored programs. I don't know if anybody saw this. It happened a few months ago now, but it was at a Dollar General and a woman was working alone and she needed to pump. So she put a sign on the door, and this raised a lot of questions about what are we doing? What are businesses doing to support breastfeeding mothers? So we'll talk a bit about the protections that are in place. The Civil Rights Act and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act do not extend to discrimination based on breastfeeding. That's just good to know. We do have here in Texas some statutes related to breastfeeding in the workplace. It is better than nothing, but it's about as close to nothing as you can get. I was going to stop myself from saying that, but it's pretty close. But only about 23 states, plus I think Puerto Rico, have anything about breastfeeding in the workplace. And some of these statutes are as protective as the ACA turned out to be, but for everybody. And some of them are like what Texas did, which says you can call yourself mother friendly if these pieces are in place. If you allow work schedule flexibility, if there's a place to breastfeed that's not a bathroom, if you have a place for clean water, and a place to store the breast milk. In Section 4207 of the Affordable Care Act, they did work in a protection for breastfeeding. What's important to know is that this only applies to employees who are not exempt from overtime laws. So this excludes quite a few people. But that what they required is that the employers can provide a reasonable break time to pump, not to breastfeed a child, aged up to 1 year. And for people who are listening who don't know, breastfeeding mothers tend to need to pump about once every 3 hours, and it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to pump. So this would be, 4 times a day generally while you're at work. Employers don't need to pay for the breaks. And there are a significant amount of employees who are exempted. So though this was a good step, it really doesn't cover as many people as it should. Maternity leave. I think a lot of people have seen this chart. Just as a reminder, if you don't know this, about 178 out of the 190 United Nations countries grant paid maternity leave. We are the only developed nation not to do so. Our policies for maternity leave: no paid leave is required, and no leave is guaranteed unless you're eligible for FMLA, which about 56% of the private workforce is eligible. They do guarantee your job, not paid, for up to 3 months if you've worked there a year, if they employ more than 50 employees, and if you're not in the top 10% of earners and considered essential, which you could be exempted for that. The policies also can allow businesses to require women to roll all of your sick and vacation days into maternity leave before you take your leave. This is problematic for when people come back from maternity leave, because generally around the same time you come back from maternity leave, your child is going into childcare, which is when your child is going to be sick about once a week for presumably the rest of their life. I don't know. We'll see. So this is a tough sell. Hispanic women in general are less likely to take their leave compared to non-Hispanic white and Black women. Women who are younger, unmarried, or low income are less likely to receive company-sponsored paid leave, and that's another very difficult fact to know. The fact that many of the women who need to take the leave can't, because they don't have the resources to offset the wages that would be lost by taking 12 weeks of unpaid leave. There are many, many benefits to taking your full leave and to being paid for that leave, but one of the most significant that I saw was that 10 weeks of paid leave at a full-time salary is associated with 10% reduction in neonatal and infant mortality rates. Paid leave is really important. Not only are people not taking their leave, or if they are taking their leave, they are suffering in the way that people view them. If they take their leave, they're suffered in their work-related evaluations, and if they don't, people assume that they're not dedicated to their family. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And then just briefly about postpartum depression and how it relates to your job. Honestly, every slide could have been its own presentation. So again, I'm hoping that if any of this is interesting to you, you'll look into the references at the end and do your own digging. We know that the quality of the job, if it's poor quality, it leads to greater feelings of work-family conflict, which is associated with postpartum depression symptomatology. an important piece of that is that poor quality jobs spill over more. They interfere more in your home life. And the reverse is also true. We then see more interference from home to work. So the theory there is, let's say I'm having a tough time at work, and so I bring that stress home to my family, and that stress makes me snappy with my husband, it makes him snappy with me, it makes us impatient with our child, and then my home life is not fun, and I go back to work and I'm upset at work again. What really stands out to me is the amount of responsibility that is on the woman to kind of manage both of these places and make sure that both of them are going well and that people are calm and happy. We also see that there are higher, and this is obvious, but that higher levels of depressive symptomatology leads to more absenteeism from work. And going back to our maternity leave, if you take a shorter leave, you're more likely to experience symptoms of depression. So those are some pieces of what people consider to be the choices. Again, postpartum depression is not a choice. That's sort of a clumsy way to connect those two. But the actual behaviors that people are doing that take them away from work more, that some theories suggest are the reasons that for this maternal wall. Another part of the puzzle, what are mothers expected to be doing? What are the roles that mothers are expected to play that they are not playing, and that leads to conflict because they are working as well? The ideal worker is the concept that's been around for decades now, and it's the idea of somebody for whom their only responsibility is employment. The ideal worker is at work, face-to-face as much as possible, is on call, can be there on the weekends, can work late, can be there in the middle of the night. And this is really framed around some of these long ago patterns where men worked outside of the home and women handled the responsibilities at home. And this sort of perpetuates that expectation that you can't be both a mother and an ideal worker because your responsibility is shared. This will be a review for those of you who saw Dr. Stinson's talk, but just in case, the types of stereotyping that we generally talk about are descriptive and prescriptive stereotyping. So descriptive stereotyping, some people call it statistical discrimination, is the idea that because most people do X, you will do X. Because most mothers tend to cut back hours after they have children, your boss assumes you will do so as well. And what also plays into this is cognitive bias. So when you go into any interaction with this in your mind, that shapes how you interact with people, that shapes how you see people, that shapes how you remember stereotype consistent and inconsistent behavior. So when women do things that are consistent with that, they are leaving to take their child to the doctor, that sticks in your memory. When they're there all the time and not cutting back their hours, staying late, you don't tend to remember those things as well. And it shapes what you infer about their behavior. When a man is at his desk, or sorry, when a man is not at his desk, the assumption is that he is working, he's on a business meeting, he's researching somewhere, he's in the lab. If a mother is not at her desk, many people will infer that she is doing something related to childcare. And prescriptive stereotyping. So this is not just assuming people's behavior, but requiring stereotype behavior. So this is wanting people to adhere to your biases. This is an employer telling a mother, don't come back to work, children need their mothers at home. So it can even seem benevolent. Or telling a mother to leave promptly at 5 to take care of children while keeping a father late so that he can support his family. So what are some of the ways that mothers are stereotyped? Parenthood makes women particularly vulnerable to gender stereotyping in work settings. Many of the stereotypes that already exist in work settings tend to be sent into high gear when women become mothers. And this also has a trickle-down effect on non-mother women at work. These are going to be some of the maternal behaviors that are often asked of women in the workplace, like planning the birthday parties, or putting together the presents for somebody, or making sure that there's food for the meeting. These are maternal behaviors that are often asked both of mothers and non-mothers, and there's been some suggestion that's because it's reflective of that maternal stereotype. There's the mommy track, which is both a descriptive, so some people do withdraw from work in order to spend more time with their family. And it's also used as a prescriptive stereotype when people find themselves being mommy tracked because they are a mother and the assumption is from their supervisor that they don't want the type of opportunities that they think somebody who is not a mother would want. Also, women are perceived as, once a woman becomes a mother, they're perceived as warmer, but less confident. And while men are perceived as both more competent and warmer as fathers, this is a problem because warmth doesn't get you promoted, confidence gets you promoted. So again, we see the resurgence of that fatherhood bonus. More ways that mothers are stereotyped. Managers categorize them as having greater family work conflict than mothers self-report, even after controlling for our own perceptions. And those perceptions of that conflict that may not even be there influence the perceptions of fit and performance, which then goes down on to relate to promotions and promotability. This starts even before we have children. So people prefer pregnant women when they behave passively than when they behave assertively. I think people prefer women when they do that, but it's neither here nor there. Another talk, secret talk afterwards. Performance reviews of female managers decrease after pregnancy, in part due to the stereotype that women are overly emotional during pregnancy. So what are some of the unique factors associated with academia? We kind of teased this earlier, but something that, another factor that researchers about mothers in academia have said is not being paid enough attention to is the idea that the tenure track and the time of your life when you're supposed to be as aggressive as possible, when you're expected to be maximally productive, overlaps with optimal fertility. So it's the same time that we're supposed to be having babies. The tenure system was created at a time when women didn't really work outside of the home. And many of the early professors were unmarried men who were expected to live on campus and in residence at the university and write their papers. So a lot has changed since then, but the tenure system itself has remained much the same. So are we looking different? Well, mother professors spend more time on domestic labor than father professors. They make less money and are expected to advance less than fathers. They report higher work involvement and similar work availability, even though superiors report that they expect far less availability and flexibility to advance. Female early career researchers with children work similar hours to men with children. And this is a bit small, but if you look at the tenure track faculty, and if you kind of orient down to the total work hours versus total domestic labor hours, if you see for all faculty, well, let's look at all faculty first. So for all faculty, total work hours are significantly higher for men than for women, whereas domestic labor hours are significantly higher for women than for men. But for tenure track faculty, there's not a significant difference between the amount of work they're putting in, and women are engaging in significantly more domestic labor than men for tenure track. So almost 60% of married women with children indicated they're considering leaving the academy. They're more likely than others to cite children as one of the reasons. And they're the most likely to indicate that balancing career and family was a source of high stress for them. They presented research findings at far fewer national conferences. And nearly 45% of women in these specific areas said that they had fewer children than they wanted because of their career, versus only about 25% of men. So I didn't want this to end on a dark, sad note. So I wanted to talk a bit about what can we do differently? How can we change this? And I think it's really important to understand that the strategies that we can put in place for mothers will be globally helpful for working culture in general. So let's start at the very top, societal. We need to adopt stronger family leave policies. There are multiple gaps in our current provisions. Paternity leave is another piece that we didn't talk much about, that many other countries provide, and it has been associated with improved relationships, improved health for baby and mom and dad, and would be an important component to consider. that we also need to start looking at some of these facilities that are not providing adequate services for breastfeeding and ensuring that across the board that's happening. Number 3 should be easy, just shifting gender role expectations and stereotypes in general. I think we can just do that for the next few days. And I'm joking, and I think it's important. I think every conversation like this helps. Shifting perception of the ideal worker, and what does that look like? What kind of society do we want? There are many societies that that support more of a it takes the village mindset. The way that we work in the US is that choosing to have children is a very private choice, and you need to raise them privately, and that needs to not interfere with the rest of your relationship with society, at least at work. And perhaps a shifting of that perception would be useful for us. Also thinking about gender role expectations, again, not just for women, but for the men who there is research that suggested that when men try to take their full paternity leave, that when they try to leave work early, that there's not just a stigma about their level of flexibility, there's a stigma about their level of femininity. So it does come back to this sort of deep-rooted sexism that to be female is to be not a good worker. Some institutional things that we could think about. Across the board, it seems that employers do well to support breastfeeding. We saw earlier that people enjoy their work more when they're able to breastfeed at work. They're less likely, we know that return of employees to work in general is about 60%. When there's a lactation support program, it's closer to 94%. So if we can improve access to private rooms, ensure adequate time to breastfeed, that's actually better for the businesses and for the women. And these are some suggestions throughout the research. I'm not endorsing any, these are just things to think about more. I think they're interesting, and I would be interested in learning more about how they work. Providing a part-time track for this is specifically for academia, providing a part-time track for early child raising years, discounting some of those resume gaps. Just anecdotally, I know that some of the federal grants you can apply for, you can talk through some of those resume gaps and you can get more time to apply for a K award, for instance, if you've had a child in that time frame. Initiating new tenure clock policies, like stopping the tenure clock. In this specific, they said for maximum of 2 children. So if you have more than 2 children, you can't do that anymore. And just in general, improve job quality, opportunities to work from home, have a flexible day-to-day schedule. What can we do in our departments? We can honor requests for creative scheduling. This is sort of getting away from the infantilization of our staff and allowing them to, as long as they get their work done, they can get their work done somewhere. Ensuring, just developing an awareness of that stereotype bias. This is a, men and women have this stereotype bias, so it's kind of across the board, implementing some ways to ensure that those strategies for making decisions about promotion and different opportunities rely on objective data. And developing mentorship models with open collaboration, making sure that there's always kind of a bi-directional conversation about expectations about workload and what you're doing at home. And supervisors need to model taking their leave. Taking leave is an important part of health, physical health, mental health, and doing good work. And so supervisors showing that it is an important part of being a good worker to take your sick leave, don't come in sick, to take your vacation and to take your maternity leave. That's going to have a trickle-down effect that is important, will be important. And you can see how many of these are not just specific strategies that would help mothers. This is across the board going to be an important process. And finally, individually, self-care and stress management. It's such a cop-out, but if I don't put it there, it'll feel like I forgot it. But yes, self-care and stress management are important. Seeking out peer mentors that both affirm your work and create a better work environment. And being really direct about your desire for advancement. If there are stereotypes in place, making sure that at least you have made it clear that you want to advance, you're available for opportunities, and you're committed to work. So what did I miss? A lot. And these are just a few of the things that I wish I could have dived into more. And I hope that if people are interested, they will. In this conversation, especially about maternity leave, places to breastfeed, we often see women being pitted against women. We see that childless and child-free academics, they feel that the policies that help mothers specifically reinforce the notion that not having children is unnatural, or unfairly penalize them for not having children. We also see a lot of the social stereotypes of motherhood, again, being applied to childless female academics. So they are also being impacted by these social biases. Number two is a huge, this is a huge thing that needs to be talked about more. Much of the research that I presented today is based on a dual parenting, dual salary model, and that's just not the norm. It's where a lot of the research comes from, it's what we know, and we need much more on families that are likely struggling quite a bit more than the ones that we talked about today. And also thinking about not just how does family interfere with work, but how does work interfere with family? So there's research that suggests that African American women, specifically in positions of power, are much less likely to find partners. And so that's being called a family wall. So having to choose, not just choose your family over your job, but choosing job over having a family. The cost of childcare. This is a huge problem. Only about 11% of civilian workers have childcare assistance through their employers. And it can cost close to 40%, if not more, of people's monthly income. So you end up in this work-family gain versus strain issue again, where if it is positive to have that multiple role fulfillment, but it's costing you the entire salary that you have, is it worth it? And how do you decide that? And then again, what about the men? Like I spoke about earlier, there are many attitudes and biases against men who want and choose to spend more time at home. How do we work within the system to start to change those attitudes over time? Thank you. I don't know if we can do questions because it's probably
yes,
not.
so I think BJ can unmute.
Okay.
Or people can individually unmute.
People
He said he can't unmute everybody at once.
Yes, that's correct. So if you have a question for Dr. Rohr, please unmute your system, and that way we can hear you, and then after that, you'll be muted back. Anybody have any comments or questions here in the room?
I would be interested. So I'm a mother of 3 teenagers now, and a lot of the research that appears to be out there is about new mothers returning to work. And I think there definitely needs to be a focus on that, but I think there's also a lot of other issues that happen as the children age. And people just think, oh, they're off at school all day, so it's fine. But there's a lot of other pressures that occur as children age, and they still need their parents for activities and different things. And as a mother, I still want to be there for them. So I think there more research probably needs to be done at that end also, and how that it impacts, because tenure is not a one-time thing and you're done. It continues on for many years.
And much of the research that I presented is focused on early babies, and a lot of it does look at the lifespan, and it's talking about the shifting of the household labor from what you're doing at home to having to take the children to activities, to having to leave. That some of the ideas about having a flexible schedule are being able to leave in the middle of the day to go to a school play or to a school performance or to a teacher meeting. There's also research on how mothers' interest and commitment to work shifts, and it stays pretty consistent until the children are out of the house, and then it goes to like 90% commitment to work. So it doesn't wane just because the children can put their own pants on. It's definitely something that continues to be a difficult thing to balance.
I agree.
And I think you were right in saying that, each one of these slides could turn into a talk in and of itself. So please do come back. But I think that also, and I don't know if there's a lot of research or not, when I have a moment, I try to look, but those moments don't come very often. To help mothers navigate you know, sort of the task of motherhood with their children, and then having their children understand, you know, why is mom not here? Why does mom have to stay up late at night? Why is mom on her computer? You know, those sort of things. 'Cause I think that's difficult too, and nobody teaches you how to do that. So if you are a working mother and you're working outside of the home, how do you present that, you know, to your kids? And as they age, then how do they learn to understand that your role also as a mom and as a professional will also change along with them? So
there's a huge body of research on the impact of basically anything a mother does on their child, and it's a fun rabbit hole to go down. And when I'm remembering one paper now that was talking about daughters whose mothers work and the way that they feel about kind of their self-efficacy and achievement, and how it really does a lot of good for them to see mothers working. I don't know how they're talking to them about it, but that was a nice thing to see. There's one of the things that I've been trying to focus on, because I'm moving into learning more about maternal mental health and wanting to do some more research on that, is on maternal mental health for the woman, because so much of the research is on how we as mothers are impacting our kids in some way. And that's the kind of, our role is either as a helper or herder for either the children or somebody else. And so I've been very interested in kind of learning more and about just because it turns out women are people. And so I think it's important to understand that as well.
I'd be interested to hear, and I don't know if there's a way to find out, how many men are on the call. I think, because you can't see us, but there's a room full of women here. And I think it's fantastic that we get the opportunities now to actually discuss these issues when we have not previously. No one was discussing these types of things. So I think it's terrific that you're here and we're able to have these discussions. But I think one of the next steps also needs to be that men are part of these discussions.
Absolutely.
And because I think it's terrific for us to make some strides in that direction, in the direction that we're hoping to make improvements. But most of our supervisors or leaders of our departments are men. And I'm not sure they're part of this discussion. Or even know the issues surrounding the discussion.
Right. And they may not know about that, the daddy bonus, the research that shows the men make more money after they become young fathers. That might really surprise upper management to hear that.
And even I think it's important for men to be advocates in this discussion as well, because they are a lot of times the decision makers. And women need to be at the table too, because I wonder, even if you polled all the decision makers and you asked, how often do you think a woman needs to have access to a lactation room in order to pump? They'd be like once? I don't know, like lunchtime? I don't know, all the time? Every hour? So I think that having the decision makers be invested in this and invested in changing it, whether they are men or women, and then also seeking out kind of the main players, so the people that are impacted by it, having mothers at the table to talk about it, and what are your needs, and all of those things as well, because I think part of it is simply they're just unaware of these different things because they don't have people that are coming to these meetings that bring it up as a need.
I also wonder about whether or not, depending on what industry you're in as a mother, whether or not you're able to bring your child to work with you, and whether or not taking a child to work in academia then makes you look even more vulnerable, distracted, whatever. And you think about the benefit sometimes to those children who are able to be taken to work, because then they do see what their mother does. If it's in your own industry, for instance, if you own a small business, they get to find out what work is like for them later on. But I think that women in this kind of environment are reluctant to bring, in fact, you're told not to bring the child to work. But I mean, I think that's a double-edged sword, because then the child doesn't see what you do. But, you know, it just has so many downsides if you aren't able to occasionally. And I think if a man brings their child to work,
Father of the Year.
Different, they're perceived and received very differently.
Anybody have any questions, comments? Well, folks, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to Dr. Rohr for her wonderful presentation. It was enlightening. We have a lot to learn and many places that we can take this information to, and folks that we can discuss this with. I think it's important to share also with your students, regardless of where they are, because one day maybe they will be parents, maybe not, but maybe they will work with those who are, and so that will also impact their journey. I think it's important for us to also figure out what we can do in our own institutions and our own environments to be supportive of those around us. I am very happy to share that my children have shared in happy hour and fellow postdoc celebrations. They've always been very welcomed by my colleagues. They have come to poster sessions at conferences and have walked around acting like they're ranking people's posters. And I've had smiles and frowns all at the same time, but I think it's also very important as women to sort of hold your ground and stand up for what you think is best for you as an individual and as a professional, and for the well-being of your children, which can be difficult at times. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Part 3 of Women in Academic Medicine will continue next month, and the invitations will go out. Please do not forget to complete your evaluation form, and then the CE certificates will follow shortly after that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.